Section 1. Introduction to modal verbs. Modal verbs are like helpers for main verbs. They add meaning to what we say. For example, can shows ability, will expresses future actions, and may indicates possibility. We use modal verbs to express things like advice, obligation, or necessity. They are important for speaking and writing English correctly. Section 2. Understanding should. In this section, we will delve into the nuances of the word should and how it is used in everyday language. Should is a modal verb used to give advice or suggestions. It is often employed when we want to guide someone towards making a better decision or taking a beneficial action. It suggests what is the right or best thing to do. When we use should, we are implying that there is a preferable choice or a recommended course of action. For example, you should eat more vegetables means it's good for your health to eat vegetables. This advice is based on the understanding that vegetables provide essential nutrients and contribute to overall well-being. Should can also express an expectation. It is used to indicate that something is likely or anticipated to happen based on certain conditions or norms. For instance, he should be here by now means we expect him to have arrived. This expectation is based on the usual time it takes for him to get here. Remember, should is less strong than must. While must indicates a necessity or obligation, should merely suggests a recommendation or a piece of advice. It suggests a recommendation, not an order. Using should allows for flexibility and acknowledges that the final decision rests with the individual. Section 3. Decoding must. Must is a strong modal verb. We use it to express obligation or necessity. For example, you must wear a seatbelt in the car means it's a rule, and you are obligated to do it. Must can also express strong recommendation or deduction. For example, you must see this movie, it's amazing, means I highly recommend this film. Remember, must indicates something is essential or required. Section 4. Exploring ought to. Ought to is similar to should, but it carries a slightly different nuance. It expresses advice, obligation, or expectation, often with a sense of moral duty or correctness. For example, you ought to study harder for the exam means it's a good idea to study more to improve your chances of success. This implies a strong recommendation, almost like a duty. Ought to can also express probability or logical deduction. It suggests that something is likely or expected based on reasoning or evidence. For example, he ought to be home soon. He left work hours ago. This indicates that, based on the information available, it is reasonable to expect his arrival shortly. While similar to should, ought to can sound more formal and is often used in more serious or professional contexts. It adds a layer of formality and weight to the advice or expectation being expressed. Section 5. Comparing modal verbs, should, must, and ought to. In this section, we will delve into the nuances and differences between these three important modal verbs. All three modal verbs, should, must, and ought to, can express advice or obligation. They're often used in different contexts to convey varying degrees of necessity or recommendation. Must is the strongest, indicating a rule or requirement. It is used when something is absolutely necessary or mandatory, leaving no room for choice. Should and ought to are similar in strength, suggesting what is right or advisable. They are often used to give advice or recommendations, implying a sense of duty or correctness without being as forceful as must. Must does not have a past tense form. This means that when we need to express a past obligation or necessity, we cannot use must directly. We use had to instead. Had to serves as the past tense of must, indicating that something was required or necessary in the past. For example, I had to leave early yesterday. This sentence shows that leaving early was a necessity or requirement at that specific time in the past. Should and ought to can be used to talk about the past with have plus past participle. This construction allows us to express past advice or recommendations. For example, you should have seen his face. This indicates that seeing his face was advisable or would have been beneficial in the past. Or you ought to have been there. This suggests that attending the event was the right or advisable thing to do, even though it happened in the past. Understanding the differences between should, must, and ought to helps us communicate more precisely. Each modal verb has its own unique role in expressing necessity, advice, and obligation, both in the present and the past. By mastering these modal verbs, we can enhance our language skills and convey our messages more effectively. So, remember to choose the right modal verb based on the context and the level of necessity or advice you want to express. Section 6. Common mistakes and how to avoid them. Learners often use must when should or ought to is more appropriate. Remember, must is for strong obligations, while should and ought to are for advice or recommendations. Another common mistake is using to after must. Remember, must is followed directly by the base form of the verb, without to. Practicing with these modal verbs will help you avoid these common errors.